Okay, good afternoon, rather good evening, everyone. Being at the very end of the RE dialogue also means that we're sort of squished at both ends. We've had a lot of very enriching discussions this afternoon and, started almost 24 hours ago yesterday in this room. I'm told that we have another event that's happening here, so we'll probably try and squish this session into 40 minutes. But I do think that we've had a very high level and a very rich discussion about, what's the state of the renewable energy sector in the country right now, what's happening on the very large megawatt scale projects, what are some of the issues around technology, the issues around regulation, the issues around, how do you use data to do everything. And now sort of the time has come for us to talk a little bit about one of the sectors that's quite close to my heart, which is the rooftop sector. And maybe let me just begin quickly with a story. My daughter is about 4.5 years old. She really likes her her stories, fairy tales, and one of the stories that she really likes to listen to is that of the ugly duckling. So the ugly duckling is like this little hatchling. He's born and he's a little unusual. He doesn't know what's wrong with him, but people around him, sort of treat him a little differently because he's a little strange. So he kind of goes away, and then he comes back after some time when he's grown, and then very much to the surprise of everyone and to his own surprise, he has turned into this beautiful swan. So the rooftop sector probably is at the cusp of being the ugly duckling of the Indian renewable energy story. So let's see whether the rooftop sector can actually grow into this beautiful swan. So with that, let me start with Mr. Navaya. Ask you the question from the point of view of a discom, sir. Who is really the face of the electricity sector, like the whole energy system, and the consumer. From your point of view, what do you think is the role that the discom plays and can play in enabling scaling up of rooftop in the years ahead so that we can reach our potential?
Thank you, Bhaskar. I think when we talk about the discom, whenever there is a discussion in solar segment, maybe megawatt scale solar, rooftop solar, and somewhere, discom is always a midway somewhere. And on ground reality, I mean, discom plays a very important role when it comes to the creating a rooftop solar connection for any consumers, because developer has to go to the discom for the clearances, their settlement to the discom bills and all that thing. And discoms need right now, as per the policies, I mean, discoms just acting as a facilitator where they are creating some kind of settlement mechanism on the bill on the net metering thing. But often, and I mean, what we have observed, I mean, in last, for example, in BSES, we have around 15 megawatt of capacity of around 200 consumers. But out of those, around 40% are domestic consumer in numbers. But the capacity per se of the rooftop solar installed is around 1 megawatt out of 13 megawatt. So, I mean, so for the discom perspective of if all the CNI customer will go away through the solar river, then there is a requirement, then there is a tariff mismatch which may happen in future. So discom and further, in order to infuse solar segment or rooftop segment in any discom area, there is a requirement to infuse more solar in the residential area. So discom involvement here comes very important, because the consumer, there is a link between consumer and discom, which is on the daily basis, on the monthly basis, on the various aspect of electricity and other related issue. So discom can play as a awareness campaigner, which where the discom can go to the consumers, can go and can act as a middleman between the developer and the consumer. We have been trying to become as an aggregator for the consumers, where we are talking to around 300 to 400 housing societies, where they can come along and we can act as a one platform. As of now, there are hiccups, there are issues in the residential sectors, mainly because one is the emotional linkages with the rooftop, which is there very much prevalent, because we are talking about the rooftop of being going for the 25 years. Then there are issues from the developer side when they are saying in the financing and the trust factors. So in order to resolve all these gaps, if discom if some business, creative business, innovative business model come with the regulatory policy per se, and discom act as a middleman or act as a trust for the financier also, then I think it will going to infuse in many larger.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lulvaya. Kushagra, I'll turn to you. As one of the, I think SunSource was one of the first set of companies that kind of came on board with a major focus on rooftop. I understand you've also done, both rooftop as well as grid connected and megawatt scale. And also as an organization that sort of work both India and also internationally. And I know Arnaba sort of initiated a very interesting discussion about what should be the factors that companies consider going abroad, and what is the learning here, and does it sort of prepare companies like yourself better for working internationally on that sort of a forum. And also recognizing that you've kind of had a good understanding of what's happening at the CNI space, which has been the mainstay of this the rooftop area for the initial 2-3 years that now where we've seen some good growth. From your point of view, what do you think is a sort of the enabling role that a discom could play, beyond just basic net metering? And I think Neeraj's presentation sort of laid out a lot of possibilities rather in terms of business models that could open up. So, as a developer, what do you see, or what would you like to see the discom do, which would facilitate and help you sort of be more successful as someone who's working in this sector?
Thank you, Bhaskar. So you're right that we have been doing a lot of residential, actually very less residential, but more commercial industrial projects and some utility scale, both in India and other parts, mostly in Southeast Asia, and a few now we're looking at in Africa, a few countries, and Middle East. But coming back to your question, we see tremendous change because the way we have been interacting with utilities. We started a journey somewhere around 2010-11 where we moved back to India. And that time there were no regulations. We remember we did our first project in Delhi in 2012 or 13 with Vasant Valley School, and it was so tough to get the approvals done. But now we see there are utilities like in Delhi in BSES. You file the application, it's so smooth, it just goes through and without any much intervention. But then there are utilities which are in higher tariff states in UP, Rajasthan, other states, where the junior engineer or the assistant engineer or the SDO level does not even have information how the regulations are or how to file the applications. I think the problem is in those states, not I think in Delhi or NCR. So because and you look at as a CNI, now we develop our own projects as well and invest in projects as well. So our challenge is not in Delhi. Our challenge is other states where and industrial clusters are generally remote clusters, right? And over there, for example, we are looking at some projects in UP. So the even the assistant engineer or SDO wants to file the application. He says, I don't have the details. So you can, if you can provide me what the policy documents, I can help you file that. So I think that is one. Education is one aspect when the utilities can provide more education to their own people, right? That is one piece. The other is future or growth aspect of the solar. So one is if they can share more data online, right? More forecasting of the data online, right? How a certain cluster, let's say Rajasthan or let's say a certain state, okay, this is how the entire state looks like, but these are the pockets where they have to do lot of blackouts or brownouts, right? But this is how it can be prevented if solar can be deployed in this much time. So more forecasting, more IoT based data, basically, or more forecast demand can be generated. And I think more somehow representation in the education of the utility people on ground, maybe from the developers perspective side, so they can also help them educate and provide more material to it.
Thanks, Kushagra. I was going to go to Amar next, but I think since Kushagra, you raised a couple of very interesting points about use of data, use of technology that would enable the rollout, and sort of course, you also touched a lot about capacity of the discoms, which let's come back to that in a few minutes. But on the point of data, I want to turn to Simran because Simran, you and I have worked together for some time now, and in your previous capacity at CTO at Booth, I feel you're one of the few people in the industry who have sort of looked at both the off-grid as well as the grid sector. So I know you're smiling because you don't want me to ask you this question, but I'm gonna throw this on you anyway. Because you've also designed a lot of microgrids, mini grids, and you've also done a whole bunch of work in the rooftop space. And fundamentally, I think the trends are that as the markets mature, the lines between off-grid and grid-connected are going to blur. So of course, there are certain areas which will always remain so, and so and I think that's also the point where discoms are going to be very important because this is probably the most remote reaches of the grid where the stability may not be as good, and so the technology both on the mini grid microgrid side, also on the distribution side, will need to be upgraded. So from your point of view, what do you think are the technology solutions current, emerging, or desired that would enable sort of greater integration, which would ultimately then open the door for more rooftop?
Right. So thanks, Bhaskar. I'll come to your question in a bit. Before that, I think we need to understand why rooftop is important to begin with. Right. Globally, I think we in the countries which are forerunners in solar deployment, we probably have the one of the lowest ratio when it comes to utility scale deployment versus rooftop deployment. In Australia, it's above 90% rooftop. Even in China, it's more than 40%. Germany, we are looking at 50%, similar in the United States. And we are struggling at 10%, and I don't think it's because of lack of roofs, right? Advantage, you have generation at point of consumption, so no line losses. You don't have to build the transmission infrastructure. You are actually making it a people's movement, the whole energy transition a people movement. And going forward, the new technologies that are evolving, you will require people to participate in the energy markets as Western world say become prosumers, right? Uh, Now coming to utilities or discoms, I think their the value proposition of theirs has to extend beyond RPO compliance. There is a strong case for discoms to promote rooftop solar, especially in the residential sector. Given looking at ARR numbers, and looking at some of the benefits of RPO compliance, it makes a very strong business case then. But I think we can move beyond that, and I'll come to that in a bit how we can do that. Uh, Another thing that is happening, and also to the point of Kushagra, we are making the transition towards smart metering, right? Uh, I see no reason, why all smart meters should not be bidirectional. I also see no reasons why net meters that are being deployed are not smart meters. I see no reason why these meters are not capturing the solar generation data, and why this data is not coming to, why discoms are not capturing this data. If we do that, look at what are possible impacts that could make. Discoms will have much better demand forecasting because they will also taking into account decentralized generations. It will open, so technology will be standardized for or the meters will be standardized for technologies that are going to evolve over the next 5 to 10 years. I'm talking about demand response. I'm talking about virtual, power plants or behind the meter batteries, etc., etc. And more importantly, it will give consumers very astute and non-biased data on generation, right? Which will also build a consumer confidence and confidence of financial institution of how certain developers are performing, right? The aggregation model in certain states has worked well, but on the whole, if you look at a pan India high level view, the aggregation model has not worked that much. I mean, we have missed the targets by huge margins. The SECI tender uptakes has been very low. Even on the data they provide on the roofs, they are 60% to 80% off of the capacity that they suggest there is. Right? There are other set of challenges. There's too much standardization. I mean, in terms of technology also, not every 5 kilowatt rooftop needs a lightning arrestor. Only lightning arrestors are required in certain conditions only when it's a high, the likelihood of lightning is high in particular zones, or there are other electrical conditions. So things like that increases the cost of the systems. Uh, at the end of the day, another point that I missed, that rooftops through aggregation of monitoring, can reduce the cost of monitoring, which we right now independent developers are provided, right? And improve the governance of the solar rooftop sector on the whole, rather than controlling it. I hope that makes some sense.
Okay, thank you, Simran. So it sounds like sort of both Kushagra's intervention and also Simran, what you're saying. Uh, One clear sort of a red flag appears to be that are we sort of running the risk of not making full use of the technology that's already available to us, and utilizing it in a way that actually addresses a lot of the challenges that we've been discussing sort of over the last day, but also specifically within the context of the discoms and what role sort of the rooftop solar plays in this area. So I want to turn to you, Amar, maybe if I may ask you. So it sounds like there's a lot of new possibilities that emerge as a result of new business models. If for instance there is more active role that utilities play, there could be very utility specific business models, and I think Neeraj's presentation earlier sort of laid out some of those possibilities. And a lot of them will not be successful unless the regulation is flexible. And I think a good example is virtual net metering, which is now being discussed at a certain level. There was a recent ruling, I think maybe 3 or 4 days ago, from the Maharashtra Electricity Regulatory Commission, which sort of draw a clear line between, at what point did they sort of see rooftop stop being rooftop, and they said they probably just drew a line in the sand saying 1 megawatt, and above that they would not allow net metering. They would only consider under open access. So are these good developments? Are these, do we need to keep an eye out for how should the regulation sort of get framed at the CERC level? How does that sort of get scaled down at the states in a manner that's enabling for the sector? So if you want to react to that or any other comments you may have around this.
So largely speaking, Discom is the authority which is closest to a residential rooftop. So and therefore it is in a position where it takes the centermost importance for rooftop solar to do well. Now, it sort of creates a dilemma because we've been speaking about how it results in losses or reduction in revenues for the discoms itself. But and you were talking about the models that, and of course, the presentation made earlier that that there is probably more and more scope for distribution licensees themselves getting involved in the model and just stop being somebody who enables net metering and have more of a role. So of course, I mean that is something that is happening across the world as well as we speak, because the discoms actually are in a best place to manage it. For example, let me tell you that when a third party sets up a rooftop installation, one of the major risks that they face is recovery of tariff, right? And that's more so the case in residential, because I mean when you're doing it for commercial, industrial buildings, you have a certain bankability because you're dealing with the corporate on the other side. But in case of residences, it's always an issue, and that coupled with the fact that access to the rooftop is also in the hands of the rooftop owner or the building owner, it sort of complicates the situation to a bit. So one of the models that I was reading about and is being implemented in the States is that the discom itself is sort of getting into and setting up the system. While utilities, as we know in India, I mean, we of course, unbundling took place once the O3 Act came in, and therefore transmission, generation, distribution, lie in different entities, so to speak, which isn't the case elsewhere. So maybe it's easier for them because they can get into the generation side. But here in India as well, while a discom and the activities that they render out it's regulated, it's a licensed activity, but there's nothing in the Electricity Act which sort of prohibits them from carrying out any other business. The only sort of condition there is that if they do undertake any other business, they have to ensure that the books of accounts are kept completely maintained completely separately than their usual AARs and their usual discom business. So having said that, because this is the risk, the discom as opposed to third party developers have statutory rights of recovery, right? Now for a private developer, if the rooftop owner doesn't pay him at the end of the month for whatever he's consumed, his only remedy lies in contractual enforcement, which to the extent there's an arbitration provision, you go to arbitration. To the extent there is you don't have an arbitration provision, you go to court. But that is the maximum extent. That's the only remedy a rooftop private entity will have. Now, if the discoms were to take it in their own hands, these guys, as regulated entities, they can, under the Electricity Act, they have a variety of statutory rights to recover tariff in case of non-payment. Now, of course, when I say that the model to explore is that they set up the establishment themselves. Now, if you were to do it on a net metering kind of concept, that the rooftop, that the building owner is consuming whatever they have to consume from the discom's PV system on the rooftop, and the rest is pumped into the grid, there will be interesting to see whether actually the discom will be wearing the hat of a of a generation company as opposed to a distribution company, and whether they will then have recourse to the same rights available to them under the Electricity Act as a distribution company. But there are other things that could be explored. For example, you could look at a completely gross metered model, where whatever energy is generated is actually pumped into the grid, and the owners get, they get a lease rental maybe, which can be sort of set off from their bill. Now, again, that is a model which works, and especially because we have been this debate, this almost like a catch-22, where the discoms, they are the best place to encourage it, but they're the best. They are likely to lose out on revenue. This might be a solution where both everybody could be happy, and of course there are several other models, and it is an animal that we have to incentivize. So we just need to find out a solution which works for both, and therefore, I'm sure the market will figure it out.
Thanks, Amar. So I think that's actually, you've given me a very good seg into, posing my next question to Mr. Silvani, because you talked a lot about risks, and you talked about how, a discom is sort of ideally positioned to address a lot of what we've heard from a lot of the banks and lenders, pose as sort of the biggest hurdle to working more in rooftop space, which is, they don't know if the PPAs are bankable. They're looking for very, very, strong counterparties when it's a third party sort of an agreement. And the moment the discom steps in, those problems, they just go away because, of all the reasons that you described. So, Mr. Sidwani, from your point of view, and I know Tata Clean Tech is sort of a beneficiary of the Jeff line for 100 million. There's a lot of concessional money that's waiting in the sidelines, waiting to support the rooftop sector, but we have not seen, a lot of sanctions. So clearly there is something, there's a bit of a gap here. So do you think, from your point of view as a lender, when you look at a rooftop project, if the discom had more active role, would that make you more likely to see this project favorably? Do you see that as something that could help scale up?
Absolutely. See, if you look at the risks that any rooftop project faces, financial risks are not independent of the risk that a developer faces. Ultimately, a financier is assuming all of those risks that a developer is also facing, because in most cases it is non-recourse project finance. You are taking a call on the project, and if project doesn't do well, a financier is also not likely to get compensated. So you need to really bucket the risks appropriately. And if you look at the risks involved with rooftop, yes, utilities need to play a far greater role, but we also need to see where and why utilities are reluctant. And the biggest reason, and I remember maybe a year and a half back, we were in a meeting with the MSEDCL chairman, and we were asking the same question: what do you think of solar rooftop opportunities in the state of Maharashtra? And he was saying, what is the incentive to me to provide net metering, provide my state grid, state infrastructure to solar rooftop players without getting compensated at all. Why should I do that? I have so many other issues at hand. I mean, if I look at the farmer suicide, I look at many others, many other issues facing the state of Maharashtra. Why should I spend my public money on compensating private sector? And in a way, I agreed with him, and therefore I thought utilities also need to be compensated. One of one of the ways I thought would be, for example, all utilities today have some or the other kind of RPO obligations. What if you could give them extra weightage for solar rooftop? So as against say buying power from renewable energy sources, which is utility scale, where the weightage could be 1, here it could be 1.5, 1.3 or whatever, that could be one. Second, at least in the intermediate terms, could there be a service charge? It could be a nominal service charge, and I still think there is a lot of arbitrage between what the consumers pay to the grid versus what rooftop can cost and can price as far as the eventual consumer is concerned. Third, there could be a fund. For example, there are, and I don't think you'll actually utilize much of that fund, but it'll at least instill a sense of confidence in the utilities thought process, because if that fund could somehow ensure that in case they are losing out on their so-called high-paying consumers, and there is a data to establish that they've actually lost out of those consumers, at least part of that could be compensated through this fund. That will also help a great way. Coming back to the model of discoms being a generator themselves, I think it's a wonderful idea. Not just in US, I think US there are 2 programs already running. Even in UK and Germany, some programs of that nature are being run. And again, it is about bucketing of risks. We are in fact piloting a program with Tata Power Distribution, Tata Power Solar and ourselves, where we are saying if Tata Power Distribution just could assume the risk of collection, we could be the owner of the assets. So in that case, Tata Power Distribution doesn't even need to own the assets. It just needs to assume the responsibility of collection, right? So whole new kinds of innovative new business models could emerge, and Tata Power Solar could take the responsibility of installation and maintenance and the regular operations of the rooftop. So you have 3 or 4 stakeholders, each with the set of responsibilities and each with defined risks and rewards. So I think there are solutions to, there are solutions to all of these problems, but we probably need to look at them holistically and not in isolation. Otherwise, if we try to push through all of these measures without utilities actually wanting to buy it, it is going to become very difficult, because you'll be able to push it to the extent where they are buying 300-400 megawatt. Beyond that, there'll be a stiff resistance. As it is, we are seeing the financial health of DISCOM is not in great shape, and so I think we need to look at something more innovative, so that there is a buy-in and there is something in it for every stakeholder.
Thank you, Mr. Sindhwani. Mr. Nalvai, if I can come back to you, sir. I think we've heard a lot of comments which basically suggest that there's a need for DISCOMs to play a sort of a little bit more of an innovative role, sort of think outside the box. And as one of those DISCOMs who are doing exactly that, and we also heard about a number of other issues, like Kushagra, you talked about how Delhi is actually a good example where rooftop applications go through, but a lot of the other states this is not the case. So there's clearly a need to build capacity, to be, to roll out maybe a lot of the good things that you may be doing here, and what can other states learn from that. And I think Mr. Sindhwani also raised a very pertinent point that this opens the opportunity of a redistribution of risk between various stakeholders, and maybe it's just a question of how do we align this in a manner that gets the best party to take care of the activity or the role, that they're best suited to play, and as a result, makes sort of, the sector more successful. And the last bit I would just add in there is just the capacity of the linemen, the people who are signing the approvals for, net metering, people who are looking at applications. So I think a lot of, engineers sort of who are within the utilities sort of building capacity for those. So if you could talk a little bit about, so what was your thought process as an organization, thinking about how would we come in, what would be the role we play, what kind of a business model do we choose? If you could talk a little bit about that, and how do you sort of prepare yourself to kind of go out there and roll out a program? You did mention that the CNI continues to be a big focus, but how can other utilities, other discoms sort of learn from your experience, and how can that be scaled?
I think first I will take the capacity development program, because I mean, if we talk about Delhi, it is very close territory. Because if one policies, we issue some policies or DRC issues some policies, it can be calculated at within very close frame of time. But in state, I mean, when the boundaries are very large and the field level deployment is to the JE and AE level, so there's a requirement of capacity development program, and for that, DISCOM need to be supported well. Unless until those program will not take place, and I mean this kind of infusion, I mean consumer may drive their, or this may be the consumer driven market. Consumer may drive this proficiency in future to come. They may ask for this, but unless until those things are not there in the field level capacity, I mean that's one thing. Second, you have indicated clearly. I mean, there's one flip side is the revenue from the CNI customer. And if we take the residential customer here in the rooftop solar, there are gains. But apart from those, I mean, there are many other gains which are, I mean, need to be quantified and need to be aware. I mean, like it is capacity deferment programs. I mean, when some kind of, suppose there are 1000 kV of transformers and 200 kV of solar, so I can defer my capacity expansion in long term to grow. And there is a demand response program. We are already running demand response program based on smart meters. I mean, what kind of on every half an hour kind of thing. There will be, I mean, efficiency program which we can run from this kind of thing, because the same problem we are facing in energy efficiency program in residential sectors. Those kind of points are there. But at the end of the day, business model, what the DISCOM, because DISCOM has a leverage of connecting with the people, and DISCOM has a very good, I mean, place right now to explain this kind of program. The best model which DISCOM can take is either I can take a, they can become a mediator. I mean, not an aggregator. I mean, some kind of mediator in between the developer and consumer. And in regards of giving some kind of trust to the financer, I mean, on-bill financing model is one of the best model which can be suited, because we ourselves have distributed around 20 lakhs LED bulb through on-bill financing kind of thing. I mean, it was paid in 10 rupees on per month on the bill kind of thing. So, I mean, once those trust will be there between the developer and the financer and the customer, the DISCOM is there in between, and this financing can be very well trusted. I mean, financing those housing societies and residential society would be very easy. Second is the policy. I mean, like virtual net metering policy, group metering policy, where there is a combination of one solar to many solar. Because I mean, many cities are in the vertical kind of range. I mean, and when we talk about the state also, there are class B, class C cities where the vertical expansion is going very high. So those innovative kind of policies need to be taken out, where there's a one rooftop solar model, and there will be multiple beneficiaries. I mean, we call it community-based model in US and UK. So these are the two or the three major points. And the last is the awareness. Awareness to the consumer is prominent. I mean, consumers are really not aware because they are confused about the drop in prices. We went to consumer, we were asking about 4.66 rupees per kilowatt hour, and they were talking about 2.5 rupees per kilowatt hour. So I mean, those kind of awareness kind of things need to be. But for all these things, there's a support required. I mean, from some kind of fund, from MNRE or some other institution.
Thank you, sir. So I think we're slightly short on time, so maybe I want to come back to every panelist and just maybe ask a very simple question, and sort of get a sense of what you feel from your point of view, your understanding of the sector. So we all know that India had initially announced a target of 40 gigawatts of the original 100 gigawatts target coming from rooftop. I think there's sort of unwritten, unsaid, unspoken sort of an understanding that we will not be aspiring for that target, but it's probably going to be lower. But from your point of view, and I'll probably start with you, Simran, just very briefly, and then I do want to leave maybe time for one or two questions from the audience. What do you think is sort of maybe the one most important thing that could be done that would enable, a significant penetration, which is not just, a dismal 10% of the total sector, but, the new upgraded target for solar, for rooftop to play a role in that?
So I think, unfortunately, the Indian consumer is stuck with the per watt peak pricing, whereas globally there's a more focus on performance and long-term generation. Uh, that has to change, I guess. I mean, the developers are crying, market is crying. So nobody is really happy doing rooftop at the end of the day. People who are doing it wants to get out of it. And that's been my experience also being a CTO and then CEO of a company dealing not just in off-grid but in rooftop sector also. And so governance is another issue. Right? A strong governance will definitely improve the confidence of the consumers as well as the financial institutions. Right now, there's no grievance mechanism per se, which is active and practical for consumers to address their issues. Very often, for small-scale solar, there are instances when inverters don't work for extended period of time, and there are other quality issues also. So those needs to be addressed. At least the technical risk and operational risks are much easier to address, right? And that's the first thing that financial institution will look at.
I think, in my view, Discom has to come forward. I mean, uh, better or not, loss or not, I mean, one has to understand that this is the future and this is driven by the consumer. And once the consumer will going to decide it, that they will going to take it, Discom will have to, uh, they are obliged to fulfill the obligation. Right now, the Discom can do is, I mean, they can plan better, they can have some kind of business model creativity where they can gain much. I mean, otherwise, I mean, it will going to be taken up by the consumer and nobody can, I mean, stop them.
So I think two things. One is I think the time has now come when ERCs should be more independent of the discoms. Secondly, consumers or high-paying consumers or high users of electricity consumers should have a representation on ERCs, so they can help draft frame the laws and regulations which are required to enable these type of options to sell electricity, right? And lastly, as a discom, so I think sooner or later, what is going to happen, what happens in few countries like US, ultimately discoms are wire business, right? They're selling and they're buying and selling electricity, but ultimately they will look at model differently. One of the options can be, I think, as was also suggested by Mr. Sanwani, that there will be some sort of a charge which can be paid on per unit basis, right? Which happens in other countries and few other countries as well. And then consumer get an option: either they buy from solar, from multiple different from utilities as well. I think those are the two major thoughts which I can share.
Yeah, so from my perspective, lawyer's perspective largely, um, I think there is a lack of clarity in terms of regulation. Look, when the O3 Act came about, it didn't contemplate rooftop solar, right? So there are nuances, specific nuances of this model which are not really addressed. Of course, there are a lot of state policies and a variety of regulations of the ERC, net metering being the prominent one, through which the sort of the sector is working to the extent. But there is still a lot of unclarity. And I'll give you a couple of instances of that. For example, some policies of state do not contemplate a captive solar rooftop installation. They say either you are net meter or you can't be there, right? So, but at the same time, people are putting it up. Now that um, sort of poses a health and safety risk, because when you are not net metered, then on the day that the grid is shut for maintenance, there is a potential issue of a backfeed of power into the grid, to the extent, the appropriate devices, isolators and whatnot have not been installed. At the same time, I mean, so there is requirement for clarity whether this is allowed, whether it isn't allowed. If so, what are the approvals that need to be sought? People have been doing this without informing the discoms. I don't know what your experience has been, Mr. Nalvaya, but that's what I've heard. And on top of it, for example, in another instance we came across, I was actually advising a multilateral institution on an investment into rooftop solar, one of the prominent rooftop solar companies. And as part of that, we were looking at certain projects of theirs. And so one of the approvals required is from the chief electricity inspector, that he has to inspect any electrical installation above 660 volts. And as part of that approval, the electrical inspector, who was essentially a government employee, had set out a condition in a rooftop context that go to the ERC and get a transmission / distribution / trading license. So I mean, his role is something completely different. But the point is that the principal statute doesn't contemplate it. It is out of certain regulations. Now, of late, like you were referring to the net metering versus open access order that came through, these people on the ground are not always clear on the evolution of the law. And this is something which is evolving all the time, because it is new, has its own nuances. People are experiencing it. People are going to court and or before the ERCs and trying to get clarity. So to give it a push, while there is an enabling environment in terms of the net metering regulations, which I think most of the states in India have now, barring a couple here and there. But I think more needs to come out in terms of the regulatory environment that is going to help the investors, the financiers, and of course the project developers and the consumers themselves.
So I would start by dispelling the notion that there is any dearth of finance available for solar rooftop. I guess there's a lot of money available. Yesterday also in the discussion, I think a lot of other panelists made the same point. So in fact, as you rightly said, we are the beneficiary of 100 million line from Green Climate Fund. And my biggest worry is not, that this $100 million is going to be falling short looking at the opportunity, but I can probably at best find 40 or 50 good projects to finance. So lack of scale as far as good quality projects is concerned is the biggest worry that I have. And what do I mean by quality projects? I mean, am I being completely unrealistic? So again, as I said, the risks that we see are essentially the risks that a developer or project faces. So coming back to some way to compensate utilities so that we are seeing their sustainable role in the whole game of rooftop solar. Second, some kind of investor protection as well. So today the biggest risk I have as a lender is the contract enforceability. You are specifically in an OpEx model. What if the off-taker who's buying power from me today at 4.5 rupees, 3 years later somebody else walks up to him and offers him 3.5 rupees? What is the real chance that this entity will not renege on the contract and will just walk away? What do I do in a situation like that? So again, there are solutions available to that also. What if there is some kind of an arrangement where utility buys power from you, not at the same tariff. If you are selling at 4 rupees to this unit, maybe utility can buy at 2 rupees, 2.5 rupees. But I then have the certainty that I'll be able to I'll be able to continue selling power to an off-taker. Again, some kind of a payment security mechanism, etc. People have already talked about importance of net metering and the capacity building, and I think again this is coming out of our experience of financing solar rooftop. We have financed few projects, and I'll give you an example. It was a tender floated by SECI, where SECI was merely acting as an arranger. and this entity actually won the bid, it became so very difficult for this entity to find the eligible rooftops. I mean, rooftops were simply not available. No, I'm not saying that. So there is a lot of thought that needs to go into it, right? So a lot of preparation needs to go behind it. So the project, which could have been commissioned maybe in June of 2017, is getting commissioned now, right? And in the process, utilities are also losing, or the off-taker is also losing, because you are paying the same price despite prices coming down. So I think all of these factors are important. And again, to repeat, availability of finance is not an issue. We are very, very keen to develop this sector. We understand this right now, it is in the market development, market creation phase. And we are ready to do our bit to make sure this becomes more and more sustainable.
Thank you, Mr. Sindhwani. Okay, I think we're sort of running short on time, so maybe I will turn to the floor and then request if there's any questions. Maybe we can take one or two questions together, and then if you have any questions, if you'd like to raise your hands, or if not, then Kanika, I know I can always rely on you to ask a question.
My question is actually on the last point that Mr. Sindhwani was making now, but it's also more generally for the panel. One of the business models that Neeraj presented is what is called it's a subscription-based model. So this is again to empower households and for them to drive the rooftop revolution. It's for them to say, I want solar, but for the utility to then bundle that solar. And over time, one can assume, hopefully, that this demand is likely to grow, the subscription is likely to grow, but also, so you'd have to sort of get new solar capacity every year, and that price would come down, but you'd bundle it, and so the threat of, oh, let me wait it out, and prices are going to crash, sort of goes down a little bit, and you have a levelized declining tariff. And is that far too innovative for an investor to be like, okay, I'm not sure, let someone else try this? So I'm actually putting you on the spot a little bit, very specifically from a investment decision point of view, but also more generally for the panel, or whether how feasible you think this would be.
So to be honest, I'm yet to go through the nuances of the model, but on face of it, it does look exciting, it does look innovative, and we would want to examine this. And as I said, we are piloting a lot of new initiatives. So it's not that we'll wait for somebody else to try it out first and then we'll venture into it. We'll be more than happy to examine this. Yeah.
This is one of the kind I repeated at that time. I told about the community solar model or virtual policy. I mean, this will be some of the kind of model which will be more prominent in slum kind of area, or maybe the rural area, where we have some kind of solar capacity at place. Discom is aggregating all that and asking consumer to subscribe for that. I mean, that will be beneficial for both the consumers and both the Discom, because of the loss level and other thing. But I mean, when we are talking about the virtual solar meeting policy, it covers whole gambit of it. I mean, one solar rooftop may be owned by developer or Discom, and they can subscribe to any number of consumers to it. So I think that will be a good thing in future to go.
Okay, so I guess I will not try to sum up the discussion, but I guess I would say that it appears to be that there's been a lot of learning that we've had in the utility scale, large megawatt projects, and the rooftop space has got its own particularly unique set of challenges, but also additional levers that are available from the policy perspective, from the technology standpoint that we heard, but also, this very important and a central stakeholder, that is the Discom or the utility, and what kind of a proactive role do utilities in India sort of choose to play in the transition leading towards more penetration of rooftop. I don't know if you've got the answer in terms of whether it's the ugly duckling or it's actually the beautiful swan, but I guess time will tell. And I would with that thank the panelists and thank you very much for interventions and your thoughts and your comments, and pass it back to Kanika. Okay, thank you very much.